Many thanks to the mayor for her time and for what they're doing in Phoenix. And I want to do a special shout out here to our Pillar School partner, Arizona State University, and the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory there, as well as the Cronkite School. They are working directly with the city of Phoenix. A lot of their research is being applied by the mayor and others. They're also working closely with us because Phoenix is such a fascinating place and ASU is such a dynamic place. We have a number of students, and you'll be meeting some of them. In fact, two of them right now who live there and are doing this work. So I'd like to invite Adora Shortridge and William Walker to the stage. So if you click on your cameras, there's Adora and your microphone, and there's William. Welcome to you both. You have been working on a research project, and you co-authored a story that's posted to planetforward.org entitled "Research Project Looks for Solutions to Protect Children from Extreme Heat." Now, I want to hear about the story, but Adora, I need to check with you. I think there's some good things happening in your life. Anything you want to share with us?
Yes, thank you, Frank. I've got some amazing news. Yesterday, I passed my thesis defense and now have my master's degree. So that was a very big accomplishment.
And it's a master's in what?
Master's in sustainability. So if anybody is looking for hiring, let me know.
Okay, well, we'll turn this into a job interview a little later, but for now, let's focus on the story.
Absolutely.
William, let me come to you to start with. Your story was Research Project Looks for Solutions to Protect Children from Extreme Heat. What are we doing now, and what were you looking at sort of long-term to help vulnerable populations?
Right, so long-term, we are really looking at how we can support schools, meeting them where they are at now. So my project really focused on trying to understand how these communities feel supported in their present time and what it is that they need to become more heat ready, what resources it is that they need to feel like they can better prepare for these.
What's a heat ready school? What does that even mean?
Yeah, good question. A Heat Ready School is a school community that has supported and educated staff and has knowledgeable and protected students. And by that, I mean, these are schools that can identify, prepare, track, and respond to the negative impacts of heat.
Right. William, what about vulnerable populations? I think that was part of your interest, both of you, and in the schools that you were looking at too, right?
Yeah, of course. We looked at a lot of schools in South Phoenix, or two schools in particular in South Phoenix. And South Phoenix, Arizona is a place that has been burdened by a lot of environmental racism and redlining and a lot of injustices. So this is why Adora was very keen on starting her research there, because this is where heat is very exacerbated. And it's very interesting that Adora let me work with her and that we examined the impacts of heat on schools, in particular school-aged children, because there's not much comprehensive research on this. Children aren't always able to fully thermoregulate their bodies, and they don't always have the best perception of heat when it comes to sweat and so many other different factors just because they're so young and little. So that's a vulnerable population. Another vulnerable population is communities without access to green space, public gardens, different things like that, shade coverage. And also so much of our electricity here in the valley is used for cooling during the summer months. And it's wild how much the utility cost can be for some people. And sometimes it's not always the most affordable. Sometimes a lot of the older homes don't have that infrastructure in lower income areas. So there's just so many people that are so impacted by this, and they're not always given the agency to be better. So this is definitely
part of what you were looking at with your research. And I think it's worth pointing out, at a time when we've been talking about inequality, the same sun beats down on Phoenix, but it doesn't have the same effect in all parts of the city. This is true across cities in this country. Wealthier parts of cities have more tree canopies, they have more cooling, they have more air conditioning. Lower income parts of cities are more exposed, and there's often more crowding. I would like to invite somebody else to join us on stage now, and my colleague Lisa Palmer. She's at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. She is the National Geographic Visiting Professor of Science Communication. And so as she turns her camera on and waves to us, hello, Professor Palmer.
Hello.
You have a book, and I meant to have it here, and I was going to wave it around so people will just have to imagine. Thank you. Okay, you bailed me out. Called Hot Hungry Planet. You've been looking at heat. In fact, you've just written again about this for the Yale Center for Climate Communication. Just a quick observation from you on the heat, and then let's go back to Adora and William.
we know, climate change is occurring. Temperatures are getting hotter. Those hotter temperatures are affecting people around us, food and nature in the natural world. I wrote about climate change and the heat in my book, but also playgrounds. I mean, really, you are hitting something onto something here with the heat-ready schools and the playgrounds, especially, and kids. It's really impressive.
Lisa, let you engage with Adora and William here for a minute or two and see where your expertise steers them, their research and their storytelling.
Yeah, and I think that what I find really interesting is that you're talking to people who are taking action on the ground. They're looking at ways to maybe better adapt and change their schools. I think that playgrounds can get really hot. For instance, I think there are guidelines out there now. What are some of the ways that your research can inform those guidelines for how we can address the hot playgrounds or hot schools?
Absolutely. That's a really, really, really great question. And that was brought up by a lot of concerns from the participants themselves. And a lot of schools struggle because the shade sails and the very large overhead structures that provide the most shade are often the most expensive. And for schools of low income areas, this is difficult to afford. So offering resources and education about passive cooling strategies, things that are a little bit more accessible and can cool individuals and on the playground space to work towards restructuring the playground space to offer more shade.
Yeah, and William, I think what I found really interesting is in kind of what you mentioned about children not really having that ability to regulate the heat, but also like they might touch something, and this playground equipment can get really hot. I mean, people can get burned by it just from a hot summer day. Or even pre-summer day and spring days out there. So I guess what are you proposing, or I guess what kind of hazards can students kind of try to avoid when they're so young? I guess how do they do that?
I believe that a lot of it is honestly school policy and enforcing different guidelines and regulations to protect our children. So maybe that looks like not going to recess during like a lot of the hotter months. Maybe this looks like ample shade coverage, like in our playgrounds. One of the schools that we looked at, they were actually looking at building a lot of infrastructure such as shades and canopies to just curtail the heat of the concrete, because it is insane how hot it is. So we talked about how we had over 100 days, over 100 last summer. And of course, it's much hotter than that in different areas. So that's not always like the temperature, that's essentially atmospheric temperature. So you can like look at the concrete, or maybe you can look at the metal part of the playground. And when we were doing a little bit of field work this summer, Dora, I believe we had temperatures as high as like 140, 160, anything crazy like that. So imagine having
140, was it 140 degrees? You were out in 140 degree weather?
It was
like essentially the surfaces were like 140 degrees, like the different metal and like the different concrete walls.
So kids can maybe touch it for a couple of seconds and have a severe burn.
Yes.
Yeah, the highest temperature we saw was 167 degrees that day.
Let me invite, if I may, our audience. If you have questions, go to the Q&A and put some questions. If you've got questions for Adora and William, and although I'm going to tee one up. You're both pretty young. You grew up in this place. It's getting more. You going to stay, or is it too hot for you and you're about ready to bail and go north?
Will, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So I'm actually from Arizona, and I think that after my undergraduate studies that I will move elsewhere, but Phoenix will always be part of my home because I love it. And I'm not going to turn into a snowbird. Don't worry about that. But yes, this is definitely like a place that I want to care about. And before I leave, I do want to do more research and come up with more tangible things and results.
Are you moving because it's too hot?
Am I moving because it's too hot?
Yeah.
No.
Moving.
I think that there's a lot of adaptation that needs to take place, however, in order for people to be okay here.
Adora, are you going to adapt and be okay there, or are you moving too?
I am going to be continuing my time here in Arizona. I am going to be staying outside of Arizona or outside of Phoenix for the summer, though. It is extremely hot here. Last summer really, really kicked me. So I will be here probably part-time
So I have a question actually for all of you that comes from the audience. Dave White asks a question: how can schools build capacity among their staff, local parent-teacher organizations, and communities to address heat impacts? Great question.
Great question, Dave. Thank you so much for asking that. This is very, very important and exactly what our project really aimed to do. And schools can build capacity through addressing, they can sign up for school heat alerts with the Department of Health Services or through the CDC. They can sign up for, or they can go to the Department of Health Services School Heat Safety Toolkit, and also through that they can become more educated and bring up heat in PTA meetings and during recess, before recess.
Sure. Lisa, have you looked at that? Like what, when you've done your research on heat, can that be changed by citizen action, or not a change, but some strategies addressed by citizen action? Have you seen anything that works?
Well, from what I find that people are doing is looking for ways to address it through this guideline approach. Some of the shading and cooling stations can really help make a big difference in people's lives, especially when there are difficulties in paying the energy bill at home. For having places to go during part of the day when the heat, it's just the most hot. So having those cooling stations have really been a greatest help.
Okay, Will, I'm going to address this question to you. This one comes from Carol Werner. She asks, are you also looking at canopies that are covered with solar cells? What kind of surfaces are you looking at to change schoolyards? And you may be looking at to study it. Obviously, you're not the one who's installing them, but tell us what's going on for that.
Yeah, I honestly am open to anything. I like the idea of green infrastructure, so not so much like hardcore canopies and umbrellas, but structures that have, whether it's like desert native plants or some form of vegetation there, to have that cooling effect and to essentially build a microclimate. I think that that's something that's very important, and countless research from all over has proven that this is very helpful in curtailing heat and bringing down the temperature very low. And that's something that I would like to see here in the Valley take place, whether it's through green roofs, whether it's through like vegetative space on buildings and whatnot, because I think that's very special. And by doing that, you're also ensuring ecosystem services and really solving urban heat islands by looking at conservation and looking at communities and their engagement.
Are the schools that you were researching doing these things in a big way, or not yet?
Not yet, because funding, of course, is always a barrier, but I see this as something that is going to be adopted in the future, and something that's very important because people care about it and people have thought about these things. I can say that even at one of the schools we worked at, they may not have had like any vegetative space like on an actual surface, but they did have community gardens and permaculture systems and things like that that they were building that could essentially curtail the heat in the near future.
Adora, this one's for you, and maybe you've looked at this in your research. It's a really terrific question. If you haven't, we'll move on to something else. But Megan Parker asks, often regulations limit school staff's ability to protect children. For example, she says teachers can't put on sunscreen or sun hats for legal reasons. Are legal remedies needed? Did you look at that? What'd you come up with?
Great question. Thank you for asking this, Megan. And this was brought up a lot in our interviews. I personally believe that legal remedies are needed. That would probably look more like informal policies or protocols to meet the communities where they're at now, because of the safety and health regulations and sensitivities that go along there. But this could look a lot more like passive cooling strategies and in the form of education, especially with the families. This really, really leans more heavily in the home area, really education at home.
Got a couple people who are asking whether and why more people continue to move to Phoenix. And Bruce Brampton says, why? And should there be economic incentives in place to reduce this and limit residential development? You two are both from Phoenix. What do you know about that?
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of people come here for the job opportunities to be here in the Valley because the Sonoran Desert's amazing. It's actually the wettest and most biodiverse desert in North America. So there's a lot of opportunities here. And of course, we want people to be here and we want to develop. But as we're developing, we want to ensure that we're not having these negative and anthropocentric effects on our environment and, you know, having consequences of that. And one of those consequences being extreme heat, which is experienced by the most vulnerable. So I'd say that as we continue to develop and more people continue to move here, we need to have policies in place. We need to have infrastructure, whether it's like vegetation on surfaces, whether it's the cool pavements that Kate Gallego talked about. We need to do things like that. It needs to be something that we adapt to, because whenever we continue to just mitigate and do little by little on an incremental level, it's just going to hurt us more in the near future. And another thing is that this is a place where we suffer from a lot of our water conservation practices.
Right.
So that's like another thing. And our water is being depleted essentially because of urban heat island and urban and residential spaces. So this is something that we need to bring back because they essentially dissipate the clouds.
Right.
So I'd say that by doing all of these things over time and having those measures in place, we can bring that back and then continue to develop on a sustainable level.
Your mayor has a big task in front of her. Lisa Palmer, let me just turn it to you. In your research and looking at heat and the effect that heat has, is it prompting people to move away? I mean, we've talked about climate refugees. Often that refers to people escaping rising sea levels, but we've got extreme heat in a number of places. And Phoenix obviously is the oven in the coal mine.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think for as much as people can adapt and change to it, they will be unwilling to move and change their structures because of that. If they're able to adapt, change, if there are some safety nets in place, they'll want to stay there because of all the other, the opportunities that William was talking about. But once those get to be a certain point, once you get at that tipping point where you may not have that safety net, where it becomes so extreme that you're going to be losing your livelihoods, that's when things will shift.
Will, I have one last question I want to do very, very quickly because we do need to move on, but it's a really interesting question that Jake Myers asked. And I know it's something that you've looked at and you mentioned already, you've referenced. Addressing extreme heat, Jake writes, presents the opportunity to address extreme inequity. So how do you frame the story around equity to achieve desirable outcomes?
Of course, I think that we have a very critical time right now where we're just now realizing the environmental injustices that communities are experiencing on a massive level. So I think that we need to leverage that and turn these moments into movements and really argue that these people deserve, the greatest things in life and that they deserve opportunities for more sustainable systems within their communities because they're the ones most deprived by it. So I'd say that a lot of the research and practices should take place here, but there should also be like a lot of reciprocity to ensure that these communities are getting their needs met essentially, and that sustainable systems are left behind.
Let me take a little swing at Jake's question too. Jake, and to all of you, the one way you frame the story around the inequities is to tell the stories of the people who are living those inequities and let them explain and let them show their lives and what they're trying to do, what they're up against, what is inequitable about it. And those are stories that can be very powerful told in the right way. Okay, before I let you go, congratulations on having your new degree. Adora, what do you want to do with your career? You want a job? Okay, what do you want to do?
I am open to many different things. I have many aspirations, so it depends on how.
You want to be mayor of Phoenix,
I would love to work in the grassroots, small scale kind of sustainable area.
Okay, well, good luck to you. And Will, how about you? What are your aspirations?
Well, I'll be graduating in 2022, and then I hope to pursue graduate studies and to do foundation-based work in the future where I can do sustainability projects and work with a lot of collaborators on a massive scale and give the agency to do projects through grants and research. Those are my aspirations.
What do you think, Professor Palmer?
They have a bright future ahead for themselves, and I think they're only beginning to scratch the surface of their greatness. So I look forward to seeing what they do in their work.
We wish you both the very best and success as you move the planet forward. So we'll be watching and cheering you on. Thank you both very much. Really do appreciate your time.